we struggle with healthy boundaries, maintaining them, erecting them. We're here to give you some advice and guidance into what healthy boundaries look like, what internal and external boundaries look like, even what it might feel like inside. Put up a boundary and not exactly know how to do that based on how you feel. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you hit the subscribe button below and the bell to be notified every time we post a new video about herbalism, healing, and alignment. I'm Tami.
And I'm Selima. We're co-founders of Iwilla Remedy, where we help you turn your health issues into non-issues from the inside out. So we taught thousands of students in our various programs how to heal using herbal medicine and the Calypso healing method. And that is our step-by-step process that essentially helps you become more aware of the behaviors that are holding you back, boundaries, and contributing to physical pain. And so we want to help you uncover the root causes in your life, make the choice to move forward and break this cycle so that you can live a vibrant life, and that's your birthright.
So, Selima, so that we're all on the same page, what do you think boundaries are? Are boundaries like a concrete wall that goes all the way up and never stops and nothing can get through? Or is it more like a line in the sand that kind of ebbs and flows based on the wind?
Right. I think like those are the extremes of what people experience with boundaries. But I think ultimately boundaries are people individually understanding like, where does my energy begin and end? Where does the next person's energy begin and end? And it's like, yes, when we're in relationship with each other, yes, we're going to meet. Our energy is going to meet. Energy is going to flow between us. But we still go our separate ways, and we understand like what our capacity is, what our power is, what our influence is, so that we don't violate, which is essentially what happens when we feel like, our boundaries aren't respected. We don't violate another person, and we also don't feel violated. We feel like, no, my being is honored, is seen, is respected. What about you? What do you think?
Well, I think we're talking about two different types of boundaries also. I think we have internal boundaries and external boundaries. So internal boundaries are the boundaries we have within ourselves, for ourselves, and external boundaries are the boundaries we have for others,
right,
outside of ourselves. And so I think when we're talking about internal, we have to understand what those internal triggers look like that say, oh, wait, we need to put up an internal boundary because we want to stop perhaps this thought pattern. We don't want to keep going down this rabbit hole. And I think for an external boundary, it's more like, I said I don't want to talk about this anymore, and I might have to reinforce that and remind someone that this is a boundary that I'm erecting, that I don't want to talk about this, so this can't come into my experience.
Right. So if I'm understanding that correctly, internal boundaries, that's like our internal communication, and
yes,
then external boundaries, like this is how we communicate and interact with our world.
Yes.
And so what makes internal boundaries important?
Well, I think we have to have internal boundaries to understand where we really begin and end within ourselves. I think a lot of times when one thinks about things within themselves, it's like, oh, this is me. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the thoughts are from someone else. And so you have to put up that boundary and ask, well, is this my thought? Is this my feeling? Or is this someone else's influence? And when you make that determination, then you get to decide like, okay, this is my thought. And then the next question to me is, do I want to keep going with this thought? Is this a thought that I want to continue? And that's when I think the boundary comes up, that it's like, oh no, I don't want to have this thought anymore. I don't want to go down this path anymore. I don't want to do this fill in the blank anymore. And so that's when the internal boundary comes up.
Right. So let's back up. Let's give people an example of the difference between internal and external boundaries.
Okay, so for an internal boundary, almost everybody in our life knows we go to bed early, like 9 o'clock early. So if our phone rings after 9 o'clock, people should know we're not answering. Yeah. With that said, we don't have to get upset about it and be like, oh, no, we're not to call us. So we can set an internal boundary, which would be like switch your phone to do not disturb or turn your phone off, put your phone in a different room. Now, someone might say, well, what if it's an important phone call? Well, Apple and Android thought of that too. So you can just set people that can get through at any time, whether it's on Do Not Disturb. So if your mother is calling you, she can always get through and contact you. The real point here is to ensure that you're not being disturbed in a time that you want rest, but you're also not getting all upset about people maybe not remembering or not knowing that you go to bed at 9. We go to bed at 9 o'clock.
Right. And then the external boundary of that would be to communicate to the people in our community, which we have and which we do, because they know, like, hey, we go to bed early. This is our routine, so that they know. Yeah.
Please don't call.
We're not answering.
Unless it's an emergency. Then you can call us. Okay, so what happens when we have weak boundaries? Because according to you, I ain't got none.
Weak boundaries are a huge contributing factor, I think, to pain, illness, and disease. Like, it creates patterns of people-pleasing, being taken advantage of, overextending ourselves, and ultimately feeling like we're living for other people instead of for us. Like, that negative emotion that we feel as a result of maybe we don't know our boundaries, or we're not expressing our boundaries or enforcing our boundaries, be it guilt, powerlessness, resentment, when we feel that long enough, it almost always leads to physical pain in the body. Healthy boundaries allow you the freedom to be yourself, honor your desires and your capacities so that you have more time, more space for yourself, for your activities, your goals, and the things that you want to do. Like, it feels really good and empowering and authentic when we tell people what we mean, where and when they are allowed in our lives and where and when they're not.
That is true.
Okay, so let's give the people some examples of weak boundaries.
Okay, so one example of weak boundaries would be the expectation of giving advice. And I will demonstrate this with a personal story. So when I would give advice to, siblings, nieces, nephews, what have you, it was always given with the expectation that it would be taken and it would be executed in the exact manner in which I delivered it. And I can tell you that has happened 0 times.
Right.
And the reason being is people have to live their own lives. They have to have their own experiences, and they need to express that in their own way. And so a boundary that is a weak boundary. And so the way I have tried to correct that boundary is that now I just lay advice at people's feet. And that's it. I have no expectation of them picking up. I have no expectation of them doing it. I have no expectation of anything. My job was I was called to give this advice. I lay at your feet and you pick it up when or if you may. And that has really freed me from the responsibility that I put on myself that their thriving is somehow my job. So their thriving relies solely on my advice being executed in the manner in which I expect it to be, and that then they take off. And what that really means is that I'm looking for the, what's the word, Selima?
Like the validation?
Exactly, the credit. I'm looking for the credit for their lives. And I can't, because the credit can only lie with the person. So it's their job to figure out their lives, to fly, to soar, and I am just here as a helper along the way and to give some advice and keep it moving.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of internal boundaries and like what's the work that we have to do inside of ourselves so that we release or don't have it accumulate that negative emotion, that frustration, that anxiety, that overwhelm, that need for validation, whatever that is. I think that's a really good illustration of that because so many people would take that very same thing, that very same example of like, I gave you this advice, and they would try to hammer it home into the other person and like beat it into them, like force them into doing something that perhaps they haven't fully processed yet, or they're not ready to do, or they're not aware of, or they just people need to live their own lives. And so that's an internal boundary where it's like, I need to manage my energy. Yes, I can still provide insight and advice and wisdom based on my experience, especially when asked, but it ends there.
Right. I mean, sometimes I'll give advice even when it's not asked. But that's a boundary too, right?
So another example of weak boundaries, well, actually not weak boundaries or rigid boundaries would be...
And one could argue that rigid and weak boundaries could be interchanged.
Yeah. Right. But say more.
Well, I mean, we are putting weak boundaries in the context of bad and that there's something wrong with them. And so I think that we could also put rigid boundaries in the same context of bad and not helpful, because they really do put, rigid boundaries really do put a blockade between you and someone else, a blockade within your relationships. And I don't believe that is what boundaries are.
Right. Okay. So an example of that, I used to be the no girl. No was ready, always at the tip of the tongue, and very rigid boundaries. And that's a trauma response. Like, we can talk about that in a different video.
We can, but hold on. We gotta set the stage. Like, I would say, Selima can't, and she'd be like, no. Like, that no was on the ready. She didn't even know I was gonna ask. And it was like, no. It could be like, Selima, I've broken my leg, can you? She'd be like, no.
I know. Okay, wait a minute. That's actually something I need to help with. But again, like, it's a trauma response where it's my reaction to no, because there had been so much violation, having a rigid boundary, having walls, that felt like the only way for me to maintain my safety and like control and autonomy, right? So I've learned, and my walls have come down.
Yeah, but I've also learned for my own internal boundaries that it is not necessary for me to seek Selima's assistance or advice or help in every scenario.
It would be like, now I'm gonna interrupt you. It would be like, can you help me hang this picture that's this big? No, I can't. I can't do that.
I like to do things together. But in any event,
you got that though.
I got that. And so I had to put up an internal boundary and be like, do you really need help in this area? Or do you just kind of want to see Selima do something?
Right. You admitted it.
On camera.
But most people, I think, I don't want to say that I'm unique in having rigid boundaries. I think a lot of people can relate to that, especially if they've experienced trauma. But I do think that most people, when they're thinking about weak boundaries, they're thinking about like doing too much for others. So what are some examples of that?
Can look like overcommitting, feeling like you can't say no. When you got to show up to that family dinner that you didn't want to go to, that you're like, I'm just not feeling today, but you put on your boots and you go, and it just drains you instead of filling you, would be a really good example of doing too much for people.
Yeah, I even think that sometimes we do that in the context of like work and overperforming and trying to, be the superstar in a particular arena in our lives. Like, if we need to be number one, I'm talking to all my Aries people. Always raising their hand, put your hand down, Like, sometimes we need to know when we need to step back, be quieter, reel our energy in, and put our hands down, not volunteer for everything. Okay, so Tami, you were talking earlier about choosing your thoughts, like being more deliberate about what you think about. So can you say more about minding your mind?
Yeah. So, I am really deliberate about what I consume. And I think that is really minding your mind and putting up a boundary of what you allow in. So, for example, I used to read a daily newspaper. I used to watch the news, and it would fill me with despair. Anxiety, depression. It did not feel good. But, I felt like if I didn't know what was going on in the world, and if I didn't read the local newspaper, then for some reason, I would be disconnected. I wouldn't be an adult. I wouldn't be doing the mature thing and being up to date on, the the latest killing, some overdose, this, that. And I had to decide for myself that I don't think that those are the markers of an informed adult. I don't think it is necessary that I'm aware of all the tragedy in the world, because it does not serve me. It does not feel good. It does not push my personal needle forward. And so therefore, I made the decision for myself that I don't watch the news. I don't read the newspapers. And anyone that really knows me well knows I don't do those things. And so you could ask me a question about current events, and maybe I'd know because I heard it in passing, but 9 times out of 10, I do not know, because I don't watch these things, because I choose not to consume myself with those things. And sometimes I even have to go a step further in strengthening that boundary. When someone's going to tell me something, I have to say, I'm going to have to stop you there. I don't want to know. And it's not, I don't want to know from a standpoint of naivete and trying to just stay with rose-colored glasses. It is really coming from a place of self-preservation. It's really coming from a place that this is not good for my mental health. And so sometimes I also have to ask myself, well, is this good for me to know? And if it is, then I really need a more fact-based, I need fact-based information without all of the glorification that a lot of times follows tragic news.
Right. That's good. I think there's a nuance there. You know, this is I think kind of a really good example of like, how do you manage your fluctuating boundaries? Because there is that element of, it's hard to not know certain things because of social media and these phones and how things just pop up on. But to what degree do you need to know every detail? And I would say, like, I used to be much more rigid about the information that I took in. I'm a little bit looser about it because I also use it as just a little bit as fuel for my work. Like, how can, within the work that we do, the healing work that we do, even the medicine that we put out, how can it contribute to solutions? So there's a little piece of like what's going on, to use that, like that 1% to fuel the 90% of like, what is my contribution for good to this world?
So let's keep this conversation going in the comments below. Let us know about your struggles with boundaries, or how you have put walls up.
Or put them down.
So Selima, we've talked a lot about internal boundaries, but let's talk more about external boundaries and maybe what makes them hard.
Yeah, I think external boundaries are really hard because these are the ways in which that we engage with other people in the world. You know, they are what we communicate, the information we take in, how truthful we are about our capacity to engage in any given moment. You know, boundaries is not just about space, like energetic and physical. That's not just the space you keep between yourself and other people. Like, it's knowing what you can and cannot do, what you should and should not do, and really having that courage to stand in your decisions over what you will and will not do. Boundaries require our constant communication because they have to be expressed and they have to be reinforced if you want them to be respected. Like, people are not mind readers. They are not always thinking about you, believe it or not. So you bear the responsibility of like educating and re-educating people on how to engage with you. Now, what is good information, though, to know about other people is if they consistently violate your boundaries, that's good information, because now you know that that person or that relationship, like the boundary needs to be negotiated to an even greater degree, or that person doesn't need to be in your life because they clearly have demonstrated again and again that they don't respect you enough to honor your expressed boundaries. In an ideal world, like, yes, we will be able to state our boundary one time and like everybody get it, but that's just not realistic, you know?
So, you know, we said earlier in this video that you're great with boundaries. And so can you just share an example of when you had to recommunicate, or you had to keep communicating a boundary that wasn't being respected, an external boundary?
Yeah, it was tough. It was when, you know, I brought up the childhood trauma that I'd experienced in our house and brought it up to the family. And lots of things happened, but as it came to reestablishing new boundaries within the family dynamic, like it probably took a good year, right, of us reestablishing, communicating what our new boundaries are, how we're going to engage. Every now and then, you get another phone call and you get another ask, and it was frustrating for both of us. Mm-hmm. We definitely got very upset about it, but at the same time, it gave me practice and standing in what I believe, why this boundary is important to me. Like every single time I had to go through my thought process and like really re-anchor into it, and to make sure that this boundary was still aligned with us, with our family, and to affirm it. Like I think that gives you really good practice on having difficult conversations and standing in your power.
So while you're talking, this just popped into my head of an external boundary that we had to set, over and over, and probably people could relate to this. Mm-hmm. So with Niles, who is our son, he's 7 now, but when he was younger, we had set the boundary that we don't tickle. And the reason, and this is when he was younger, before he could speak and communicate. Right. And so the reason that we set that boundary was we really felt that you're touching this child and you're tickling them, and yes, they're laughing, which might seem like they're enjoying it, but there was really no consent. They couldn't say, yes, I want to be tickled, or no, I don't. And so we just set the boundary that until he can speak and he can articulate that, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not, we're a no tickle family. And we had to keep communicating that was like, nope, we don't tickle in our family. And
that was a hard one.
That was a very hard one.
People with children and boundaries, like it's a whole other world where people feel like they just have the right to touch children.
Yeah, and so for external boundaries, Niles has probably been one of, I would have to say, I don't want to say hardest, but I mean, it was just, it continues just as he gets older of a boundary. Like Niles, for example, doesn't like to be hugged. And so we have to remind people, if he says no, it's no. You can't just ask, can I hug you? He says no, and then you still go in for the hug. So, these are examples of external boundaries and how you have to keep reinforcing them. And even when we hope or think like, oh, we're done, we're not.
And I think to that end, like boundaries fluctuate.
Yeah, because sometimes Niles can be like, yes, I'll have a hug. And it's like, oh, okay. Right. It's okay today, but yesterday it wasn't. And that's someone's choice. Right. That's someone's right.
Right. Like boundaries are like, they're dependent on our emotions, our desires, our capacity, like in the moment. Mm-hmm. We have to think about, do we have the resources? Do we have that emotional space? Do we have the time? Do we have the money? Do we have the mental energy to engage, like to be present, to take action? And for everyone, I think that changes from day to day, mm-hmm. and from season to season. So you might be able to say yes to something today because you have the energy. It feels good. You want to do it. You have the willingness. But in a month, like your response to the same question might be no, I can't do this. It's no longer aligned, or I don't have the capacity. And I think that's something that's really important for people. Like remember that you can give yourself permission to change your mind, and to express that change of mind gracefully and compassionately to other people.
So another thing that makes boundaries hard is that they're not universal. Everyone's not raised the same way. Everyone doesn't think the same way. Everyone doesn't do things the same way. And a really good example that happens between Selima and I, probably quite often, if I'm going to, admit it, is that my mind is always going. And when I have a thought, I expect to be able to bring Selima into that thought almost immediately. She could be sitting on the couch reading a book, and it really goes thought mouth. And I'm like, Selima, do you know what? Or Selima, what about in not taking anything into consideration of what she is doing, or where her mind is, or any of that?
It's usually work related. I mean, when we're at home, and I don't want to do that.
I mean, sometimes even at work, it's work related, and you're like, that's not where I am in my work in this moment.
Another thing that I think makes boundaries challenging is how we need to reconfigure them in certain relationships, and especially when we've been in these relationships for a long time. When we start to change the boundaries, people act a fool. This is a part of like, yes, they need to be reinforced, but you start to see different aspects to people's personalities when the boundaries are being reconfigured. Perhaps when you are now saying no to something that you used to say yes to. People might act like the victim. They're going to pull out their poor me cards. They're going to be like, why are you doing this to me? I can't believe you're trying to hurt me in this way. They might be passive aggressive.
Yeah, real
they
personal.
might gaslight you. And all you're doing is trying to establish a new boundary for your own selfhood, your own personhood, your own safety, your own mental well-being. So really being clear about your boundaries, communicating them, sadly, over and over again. Yes, it's uncomfortable. It takes practice, but I think it also really requires that you have a clear idea of the types of relationships and the dynamics that you want to engage and participate in. When we don't know what we want, it can be very hard to communicate, and we will like waver and then allow that encroachment, and then we regret it.
So to wrap this up, let's talk about some tips and practices of setting boundaries. So we talked about earlier setting the do not disturb on your phone, which is an example of an internal boundary so that you don't have to get all upset. Then we talked about setting limits on social media and news, being really deliberate about what information you allow to come in and stopping it right at the beginning so that you don't go down the rabbit hole. Now, we didn't talk about this one, so we're going to talk about it a little bit now, about spending time in solitude. It's really important to prioritize your quiet time, to listen to your inner voice, and to develop a relationship with it so that you know to trust it and that you can act on the messages that come forward for you.
So another tip is to pause before you respond. There are very few things in life that are actually urgent, and when something is urgent, when it's an emergency, your instincts are going to kick in. But for the most part, many things, you have time to respond, to gather, center yourself, and really feel into, is this something that you should engage in, not engage in, something that perhaps you can do later and you can communicate that. So that's a really excellent tip. Take a beat, take a breath, pause before you respond, before you react. Another one is remember that you can change your mind. Sometimes we get so fixated on like, I said I would do it, so I'm gonna do it, even though our capacity, like we talked about, our capacity changes. So our boundaries fluctuate with our capacity and with our emotional state. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're flaky. You can tap into whether that's a pattern. There's no judgment here, but you can tap into whether you like seriously have commitment issues or you can just remember that you can give yourself permission to change your mind when your capacity changes, and that there are ways to gracefully and compassionately express that you no longer have the capacity to do something that you said before that you might be able to do. And lastly, I would develop some like practice prompts. I would practice them in the mirror, ways in which you can say comfortably, saying no without feeling like you're offending or you're over-explaining yourself. I actually created an IG reel on this, so we'll link to that in the caption below so that you can see what I came up with 7 prompts that you can use that are short. You're not explaining, but you're simply saying like in different ways you're unable to do something right now.
No.
I know. So if you're looking for a comprehensive herbal program, healing program, consider joining us inside Herbal Medicine for the Soul. It's our online mentorship program. It's really a hybrid, but we're helping you break the cycles of chronic physical pains, mental illness, pills, side effects with herbal medicine, spiritual self-care, emotional alchemy, the Calypso healing method. It's a remarkable program, I must say so myself. And whether you're an herbalist, someone who's interested in holistic healing, or even a medical practitioner, everyone is in our community gathering their skills, gathering their tools to be able to help and serve and break the cycles for themselves, as well as help people within their community.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.